Good morning, everyone, or good evening, or good afternoon, wherever you are in this world. You are tuning into another Left Lens Live. As you can see, I'm joined by the new Atlas's Brian Berletic, very special guest. Thank you so much, Brian, for taking the time out of your evening. How are you today?
I'm doing well. Thank you for having me.
Great. So as you're coming in, everyone, you know what to do. Make sure you are hitting the like button. That's how you boost the stream. Also, give me a quick sound check as we turn it over to Brian in about a minute. And don't forget to hit that like button, hit the subscribe button, plus press that notifications bell. That's the best way to get notified here on YouTube. But I am asking everyone to go down to the description of this video. Make sure you're subscribing at the very least on Substack because I get your email, and that is, I think, the best way to build up the ability to get notified when I go live, the most reliable way, so we don't rely on YouTube algorithms and whatnot. But with that said, also consider becoming a paid subscriber. You can do that on Substack, on YouTube, or the best place is on Patreon. So with all of that out of the way now, let's get to the meat and potatoes of this stream. All right. So, Brian, we are only a couple of days away from this 1-year anniversary of NATO's war in Ukraine. I am calling it because I believe that's what this has always been. And let's start here, though. What do you feel like, in your view, is the most important elements of this conflict to understand over the past year? And given all of these escalations in Ukraine that I think me and you both agree were provoked by NATO. And oftentimes, of course, this is called Russia's unprovoked war from Joe Biden, EU leaders. We can go on and on and on. But what do you feel like is the most important elements of this conflict to understand as it now enters its first birthday?
Well, I think what you just said, that is the most important point to understand. The fact that this was provoked by the United States. This is a proxy war between the United States along with NATO against Russia. It's not Russia waging war against Ukraine. It is Russia defending itself against a militarized proxy the US created right on Russia's border. I just want to remind people, you could go and look at articles from The Guardian. This is Western media from 2004, where they admit that not only was the U.S. meddling in Ukraine even back then, pouring money into the political system, building up opposition groups, overthrowing governments. They did the exact same thing in Georgia in 2003. They overthrew the government of Georgia. They put Mikhail Saakashvili into power. And by 2008, and this is according to an EU investigation, it was Georgia that triggered the Georgian and Russian War of 2008. That is a country with like 3 million people population. It is a tiny country compared to Ukraine. Ukraine was much bigger geographically in terms of population, in terms of military. The U.S. did the exact same thing. They overthrew the government. They put a viciously anti-Russian regime into power, which included Nazis, literal Nazis, and military units of Nazis into power. And then they started flooding it with weapons and military training, just as they did with Georgia. And what should Russia do? They just watched the US do this in Georgia, with it ending as an attack on Russia. What were they supposed to do with Ukraine? It was never a matter of whether or not Russia should fight this war. It was a matter of when it would be fought. Now, when Russia feels like it has an advantage, the economic ability to absorb the sanctions they knew were coming and that they had prepared for? Or should they have just waited for the United States to get hundreds of HIMARS launchers, M1 Abrams tanks into the Ukrainian hands, give them years of training on it, and then have this war, which would have been a disaster? It would have been many times worse. So that is the most important thing to understand about this. This is the United States, a decades-long process of trying to reassert Western hegemony across the planet to destroy any peer or near-peer competitor on the planet. And that includes Russia and also China. And we see we're going to probably talk about China as well toward the end. That includes China as well. And they're doing the exact same process vis-a-vis China that they are to Russia. Just the exact same process, just different countries that are being used as proxies and battering rams against Russia and China, respectively.
Yeah, and you know, now it's 2023, and a lot of what isn't talked about, especially in the Western media, is how a lot of the same players that were involved in the 2014 coup in Ukraine are now at the helm in Washington. So you have Joe Biden, of course, the infamous Victoria Nuland, who was also serving in the Department of State during the Obama administration, is now, I believe, third in command or second in command there as Undersecretary of Foreign Affairs. Could you talk about these players? Could you talk about, and also the coup in 2014? Because I feel like that often gets lost. This war didn't start in 2022. Really, we're only marking the 1-year anniversary of Russia's special military operation in reality, because historically, the United States, I mean, we could date back maybe even further than 2014 in terms of the U.S.'s involvement. I know that you have been covering this. Could you talk about that?
Well, it's funny you mentioned Victoria Nuland. In her capacity at the U.S. State Department back in 2013, 2014, she was on stage admitting that since 1991, they have poured billions of dollars, I think it's like $5 billion into Ukraine's political system. Imagine if Russia or China said, we're going to pour billions of dollars into America's political system. It would be deemed political interference. It would be perceived as an act of war, possibly. It would be unacceptable. But this is what the U.S. openly does around the planet, and this is what they were doing in Ukraine, admittedly, from 1991 onward. Like I said, the Western media has admitted that in 2004, I think they were calling it the Orange Revolution or the Chestnut Revolution, something like that. And that was the United States. They did that. They admit that in the Western media. That's not Russian media admitting that. You can, again, just Google Guardian, U.S. involvement in 2004 Ukraine. So that is what they've been doing. They go into these countries, they pour money into the media, into the political system, and they skew the entire process. Democracy is supposed to be a process of self-determination. Everything happening in these countries in Eastern Europe is being determined in Washington. When we hear about NATO expanding and people say, well, those countries chose to join NATO. No, they didn't. They had their governments overthrown and a client regime installed into power that then obediently pursued membership with NATO. Whether they got it or not, that's a different story. So they proposed Georgia to join NATO, Ukraine to join NATO. And again, if you just look at a map of NATO expansion, it goes right up to Russia's border. And again, just imagine if this was all reversed and this was Russia or China encroaching onto the U.S. right up to their literal border, how America would react to this, and whether it would be perceived as justified or not. I think people would perceive it as justified if it was the other way around. Yet somehow Russia's the aggressor, it's acting right over its border. Ukraine used to be a part of Russia and then the Soviet Union. They speak Russian. A lot of them see themselves as Russian, which is why it's not a clear-cut case of, or they're just invading another country. And what's interesting is I saw Victoria Nuland just this month in an interview with the Carnegie Endowment. And the host of this interview even said, they mentioned the U.S. invasion of Iraq, and they're like, yeah, but that's totally different. There's no way to compare the two. And when you think about it, yeah, there really is no way, because U.S. went around the other side of the planet, lied about Iraq as a threat, invaded when it posed no threat whatsoever. And it's the exact opposite for Russia regarding Ukraine. But from his point of view, he was trying to imagine that somehow the U.S. was justified, or it was just an honest mistake. And in this case, it's just a brutal war of choice by Russia, and it is reality inverted. And this is a fantasy world that is reinforced constantly every single day with the media, the Western media.
Yeah, and you mentioned NATO expansion, and you mentioned all of these elements that the Western media does not like to even entertain. But could you talk about how the meddling, you You talked about the $5 billion US poured into funding, fueling in opposition and anti-Russian opposition, really in a far right, dare I say, Nazi opposition. Could you talk about the influence on Ukraine's politics here? Because one of the things that's so frustrating as we enter this 1 year period, and there's just so many things have changed over the last year, but one thing that really hasn't is how the Western media talks about Ukraine, talks about their politics, talks about it as a democracy, talks about self-determination. All of these terms are thrown about. Could you talk about how U.S. actions, NATO's actions here have influenced Ukraine's politics? Because oftentimes it feels like Ukraine is portrayed as this sovereign, independent country. And then when you bring up that, oh, no, there's a coup in 2014, they will rebuke. A lot of these folks are not good faith actors, but they will rebuke nonetheless that, in fact, there were elections in 2019, and that somehow makes Ukraine's government a fully sovereign state.
Good. It's a good point. When the United States is meddling in another nation's internal political affairs, it's full spectrum. So it goes from the political system, campaigning, polling, everything in that respect. It also goes into things like education and media. And what they do is they will maneuver opposition parties into power, and then these opposition parties will ban their opponents, and they will censor media they don't like, and media that tries to counteract this narrative that the U.S. is sponsoring inside their internal political affairs. So what you end up with is a Ukraine where the only media that you see is anti-Russian media that is talking about how great Europe, the European Union is, and Western-style democracy, how horrible Russia is, how horrible China is. I'm watching the exact same thing happen here in Thailand. The U.S. pours money into the media here. You have all these fake NGOs, because how are you a non-governmental organization if the U.S. government is funding you? You're a foreign government-funded organization is what you are. And they get endless amounts of money every single year to do this. It's very hard for local media to compete against that. And it's omnipresent, and people are hearing, especially young people, which is why they always have these movements involving young people, because they're impressionable, they're rebellious by nature, and the U.S. knows this, and they take full advantage of this. So what you end up with is a perversion of their culture, their history, because like I said, it reaches into their educational system. They'll literally rewrite their history books. Taiwan has been doing this. They rewrite their history books to the point where the notion that the island of Taiwan had anything to do with China, despite centuries of history together, it's whitewashed away, and all that's left is this rebranding of history, or this reimagining of history that suits not Taiwan's best interests, but Washington's agenda against China. It's the same for Ukraine and this agenda against Russia. And when you look at a lot of these extremists in Ukraine, these literal Nazis, these are Slavic people who imagine themselves as somehow Aryan or some lost Viking tribe or something, but they're like, just look at them, they're Slavic. It's so absurd. It is so departed from reality, but this is what the US does. And it's always at the cost of the people in that country, the people who think their best interests are being served by pursuing this agenda. No, it's always at their cost. And as a matter of fact, Russian President Vladimir Putin mentioned this in his speech today. He said, people of Ukraine are being held hostage since 2014. You can just look through the Western media for the headlines. Their economy has been destroyed, self-destructed. They irrationally cut ties with Russia. They had a deep level of economic integration with Russia, and then they just irrationally cut all of these ties. All of this industry shriveled up and blew away, and now they have nothing. They're a basket case. And then now that they're in the middle of this proxy war, what little was left is now gone. So this is how the process works. That is what a proxy war is. You're fighting someone else, your opponent, and you're doing it with this proxy, and they're going to bleed and pay the price while you're very far removed from it. That is the whole point of a proxy conflict. That's the benefit of fighting one. You're muted, Danny.
Right. Sorry about that. Yeah, and so okay, well, I think that's exactly correct. And just in the last day, yesterday, we had some political theater. Definitely want your comments on this because I feel like this is just so emblematic of everything that you were just discussing. So Joe Biden took President's Day to travel to Kiev, supposedly unannounced, but then there were some rumblings from U.S. officials that indeed Russia was tipped off. There was this what seemed to be like a false alarm, maybe an intentional alarm in Kiev. The alarm, the blaring that they do when they feel like a Russian strike is coming. But nonetheless, Biden was there and pledged another $500 million. I saw that you commented on what's in this package. Maybe you can put this in the context of these wonder weapons, as I know that Duran has called them and you have called them, because that's been kind of the conversation over the last few months is how can the U.S. and NATO rearm Ukraine? There's been tank pledges, U.S. M1 Abrams tanks. Who knows if they'll ever get there? There's been Western media reports that NATO's out of weapons, Ukraine's out of weapons, yet still there's all of this optimism about the U.S.'s historic support for Ukraine, and Biden and the administration is calling this visit historic. They're calling it a historic visit. What do you think of all this symbolism and these pledges, given what has transpired, even just in the last few months with what's happening on the ground and, of course, these dwindling armaments and stockpiles?
Well, let's just begin with Biden going to Kiev. He went there. He said, we believe that Ukraine is going to prevail. We're going to stay in it for as long as possible. And Putin was, and this is how the BBC reported it, said Putin is dead wrong that if he thinks he's going to outlast the West in this conflict. But why? Why is that? Because President Joe Biden said so, or because he actually came to Kiev to demonstrate otherwise? And what did he do? He, as he was doing this, the Pentagon announced another one of these military assistance packages. And if you look at it, I cannot think of one that has been more meager than this. A lot of the items on the list usually include a quantity, but they're not even including the quantities anymore because the quantities have been shrinking month to month. So you have things like HIMARS 155 millimeter artillery rounds, the guided rockets for HIMARS, 120 millimeter mortars. They're not talking about the quantity at all for any of these because in every case, they are facing critical shortages of these types of munitions. They're out of arms. They're out of ammunition for the weapons. And that pretty much just proves the exact opposite of what President Biden said, that Russia is wrong to think that they're going to outlast us. They are outlasting. They are outlasting the West in this proxy war. If you look at the arms packages, I've talked about this many times before. They're sending Western main battle tanks. They're talking about sending Western warplanes, although in both cases they're kind of incrementally backing off now. They're at this point because they're out of everything else. Everything that they could practically send to Ukraine has already been sent. Now they're talking about things that are impractical, and they just hope nobody notices how impractical this is. When they first announced all of the main battle tanks, everyone was saying, wow, look at that. Russia's in big trouble. But then even experts in the West were pointing out that it's going to take a year or more for crews to train and then to use these effectively on the battlefield. You can't just send tanks on the battlefield by themselves. They have to be part of combined arms warfare, which includes infantry fighting vehicles, armored personnel carriers, sufficient amount of artillery, which Ukraine does not have and will not have, and also military aviation, which Ukraine does not have and will not have. So what is all of this? This is all just to drag it out. There's no hope for Ukraine to match or exceed what Russia has on the battlefield. And at this point, they're not even maintaining the same levels for Ukraine to lose at the same rate that they've been losing at all of this time. I was also recently listening to different Western analysts talk about the Russian winter offensive. Russia has never actually officially said we're going to launch a winter offensive, and no one ever said that the winter offensive has begun. So this is all assumption on different analysts' points on their part. And they were saying, well, if Russia's some people are thoroughly convinced that they're already in the middle of their offensive, and they feel like if they launch their offensive now, they're going to exhaust themselves, and then Ukraine is going to have a clear path when they launch their offensive in the springtime. But I don't see that at all. What I see, if you were to ask me what is going on right now, it looks like Russia is conducting a theater-wide spoiling operation. A spoiling operation is, your enemy is preparing for an offensive, so you disrupt it. You force them to use the units that they're mobilizing for an offensive. You force them to go on the defensive now before they launch their offensive. So you're spoiling their operation essentially. And you can see that this is what Russia is doing all along the line of contact in Bakhmut, Soledar outside of Kremenna, Vuhledar. They were pushing in Zaporozhye as well. And by the time Ukraine is supposed to be ready for this offensive, they're going to have expended all of these forces, all of this equipment against all of this pressure Russia has been placing on the line of contact. And even Western analysts are noting that while all of this fighting is taking place, huge amounts of Russian reserves mobilized, this 300,000 that was mobilized, they haven't been committed anywhere along the line of contact yet. And we remember General Sergei Surovikin, after stabilizing the front line, part of stabilizing the front line was building these extensive defensive works, tank traps, dragon's teeth, trenches, bunkers. All of these defensive works have been created. This is to receive, blunt, and absorb the Ukrainian offensive, whatever Ukrainian offensive is launched in the spring. So I think that's where we are. I think Russia is succeeding with a strategy of attrition. Everyone's waiting for the offensive. Maybe they're not interested in an offensive. Their goal is to demilitarize Ukraine, and that is what they're doing. And this strategy of attrition, this is what I'll finish up on. This strategy of attrition is what is changing the facts on the ground, which is forcing President Joe Biden to go to Kiev essentially empty-handed with empty rhetoric about how Putin is wrong about outlasting the West, while we can see that they're empty-handed. They have nothing else to send Ukraine. They have no cards left to play except to get involved directly with Russia themselves, which I think that is the ultimate fear. That is what we all have to be worried about.
Yeah, and you covered a really interesting development in the Western media through Forbes, and I want to pull up both. I'll just show everyone both. So at first, the first article was back in March 2022. This was literally published, I think, 1 month after the special military operation from Russia began. And the hubris, I think this is where a lot of the danger is too, is that there's just so much overconfidence, I think, in the collective West about this conflict, and it was no higher than in the beginning. And here, I know you covered this article, the Ukrainian army now has more tanks. So this is, this was more, this is almost a year ago. This was a month after the special military operation began. The Ukrainian army has more tanks now than when the war began because it keeps capturing them from Russia. So this didn't age well. I'm just going to pull up the next article so folks get a good idea of how this has transpired. And then I definitely want your take, Brian. So the next article this is hilarious. Ukraine is going to run out of T-64 tanks. So this was just less than a week ago. So now we have admissions that and I think the admissions have been even more stark in other areas of this commentary about weapons. But could you talk about just that turnaround and what it says, what it means? Because even though there are these admissions, I don't think there's a lot of humility about the reality on the ground.
So that is also literally the exact same guy at Forbes writing both of these articles. And what's interesting is even in the most recent one, he's talking about how Ukraine is going to run out of their main battle tank, which is T-64, which they had heavily modernized over the years, and this is what they were primarily using. Plus, he's talking about they're going to run out of them. They started out with 800 T-64 main battle tanks, so half is around 400. But then in the same exact article, they say in total they've lost 400 tanks, which makes no sense because NATO has sent hundreds of T-72s to Ukraine, and they've lost most of those. So where does that enter into his math? I guess it doesn't. And then he claims that Ukraine has captured 500 Russian tanks. So this is where they've got more now than they started out with. And if you were following their convoluted calculations, they shouldn't need any more tanks from the West. Why do they need these tanks so desperately? The urgency that we can see on both sides across NATO and in Ukraine, in Kiev, the urgency betrays all of this war propaganda that they have been pushing. And this is their fantasy world colliding with reality. And then you get unpredictable reactions. So he's repeating these old war propaganda lies while admitting that they're running out of these tanks. And in reality, most of their tanks are gone. Of all kinds, most of their tanks are gone. And that's why they're taking in these Western main battle tanks, which are more difficult to sustain on the battlefield and are not ever going to be able to be effectively used by Ukrainian forces, not in any reasonable amount of time. I don't know if that answered. There was one other point I wanted to make, but it's kind of late here, so no worries. If I could think of it, yeah.
No worries. I just got back from being away myself, so I'm a little slower to the beat today, but nonetheless, no, I mean, those are all really good points. And I just want to now maybe ask you about, before we I definitely want to get into the global implications of this, but what's next here? Because I've seen, I think we've all, those of us who've been covering this have been thinking about, well, okay, yeah, this weapon situation is ridiculous. It's so contradictory. It's full of holes. The reality on the ground seems to be shifting and moving ever more towards Russia. But even so, now, of course, I think that there's a military industrial complex involved here where, of course, it's profitable to pump weapons. But this conflict also seems to be existential in a lot of ways for the collective West. And we have to ask the question of, well, then what is next in this conflict, given that these weapons are not going to change the course on the battlefield? I know that we've all speculated, well, is there partition? I think even the collective West media, the corporate media, has even floated this idea of partition kind of ending the conflict. There's been some murmurs about peace talks with full Russian concessions or just a few Russian concessions. So there's been all this talk, but I guess it begs the question of what is next then, given that the battlefield seems to be an area that Ukraine is going to struggle in indefinitely.
Well, going back to the whole tank issue and what that author was doing, I mean, he's coming to this slow realization of the reality of all of this. And this is something the Western media is doing collectively. And I think these politicians, these policymakers who drummed up this proxy war, I've said many times before that what we're seeing in regards to Russia and China is the West just being out of time. They wanted to stop the reemergence of Russia and the rise of China, and they've failed. And in this proxy war specifically, you can see how unprepared they were versus Russia, who prepared specifically for this. The West, because they are pursuing global hegemony, they were stretched out thin. Their military was not configured for a large-scale, intense conflict like this. Russia specifically prepared for this. Their industry is specifically prepared for this. They have changed things on an institutional level to prepare for this that the West cannot and did not prepare. So where do they go next? It's a really hard question, because if the West were to back down, they constantly say if Russia stops fighting, the war ends. If Ukraine stops fighting, Ukraine ends, which is not true. It is not true. Ukraine is not going to end if they stop fighting. There will be negotiations and there will be some sort of settlement. And what is Ukraine? Because since 1991, a lot of what Ukraine has become is a construct of this Western meddling. So we keep talking about Ukraine sovereignty, and just as you said, especially with the coup in 2014, that sovereignty ended. And then they were eliminating opposition groups and media and banning, putting restrictions on the Russian language. So even if you hold an election in that environment, is that going to be a genuine, legitimate election? The answer is no. So where are they going with all of this? Their only alternative, if they cannot have what they want, they have to completely change their entire approach to foreign policy and just how the West exists with the rest of the world. I always kind of simplify it into saying they need to find a constructive role among the nations of the world rather than trying to impose themselves upon it. That's a very simplified version, but in reality, they have all of their institutions are all geared into imposing themselves onto the rest of the planet. And they would have to change all of that. Just think of the National Endowment for Democracy just by itself, and the subsidiaries and the adjacent organizations, USAID, the Soros Foundation. How many people is that alone? These are well-connected people. The people at the top are wealthy and influential. Are they going to give up? And the answer is no. They're not going to give up until it is impossible for them to continue doing this. And I think that's what Russia and China are trying to do. They're trying to create multipolarism. They're trying to create alternatives and a system, and kind of as gracefully as possible move past and away and onward without these people. And it's just going to be a process of whether or not in the West a different circle of interest can emerge and steer the country, or I would say countries, in the right direction to meet up with everybody else. Because if you are in the United States and then you go overseas, say to Asia, you could see how different society exists, and it's like day and night, and there's this divergence, and it's getting larger and larger each month, each year, I would say. The scary thing is, how far are they going to go to try to win this proxy war that is essentially unwinnable? Even if NATO intervenes directly, what do they think they're going to achieve? And then there's the whole China question. We're waiting to see what the Chinese government says. They're going to publicly announce their position on the conflict in Ukraine. And is it going to be continued semi-neutrality, or are they going to come down hard on Russia's side? And we don't know, but eventually China's going to have to make a decision regarding that. And just imagine if the US cannot compare with Russian industrial output, what are they going to do in regards to China when it mobilizes its society?
Yeah. Well, you mentioned the speech coming up. Xi Jinping has been announced that he will give a speech on the anniversary of the Russia's special military operation for this February 24th. There's also been a lot happening. Maybe we can now move into the global implications to all of this, because we had recently, over the last week, the Munich Security Conference, where you had heads of states and various officials, representatives of all these think tanks come together. The big theme, of course, was Ukraine, unsurprising. But you had over this period, a lot of lecturing being done. So you had Antony Blinken, EU Foreign Policy Chief Joseph Borrell, Antony Blinken's Secretary of State, of course. And there was a cacophony of warnings to China saying, China, this is the red line. If you provide quote unquote lethal aid to Russia, then there will be consequences. That was really the big narrative coming out of the US and the EU. For China, the big conversation, of course, was, well, how can we achieve peace? How can we end this? And there were mentions of NATO's role. And of course, China has also released a flurry of reports from their perspective on what global security should be, as well as a huge report on the perils of US hegemony that's been circulating all across Chinese media. So what do you make of all of this? I mean, it feels like what you were just discussing, this divergence is really intensifying between the US, the EU, the collective West on one side, Russia, China, and damn near almost everyone else on the other.
Well, first, let's address these so-called red lines that the West is laying out regards to China. China better not provide lethal aid to Russia or else. Just think about it, though. This is the same West that has crossed China's red lines. And as a matter of fact, their own red lines, because they all agreed to the one China policy with Beijing. And for people who don't know what that is, the West, every nation in the West, from the United States to the UK, the European Union, also nations like Australia, they all agreed with China, the People's Republic of China in Beijing, that there is only one China, that Taiwan is a part of it. There is no independent Taiwan. And yet, at the same time, after agreeing to that and agreeing to it for decades, as a matter of fact, they treat Taiwan as if it isn't some sort of independent entity, and they flood it with weapons. So especially the United States, they flood Taiwan with weapons to do exactly to China through Taiwan what they're doing to Russia through Ukraine. This is blatantly what they're obviously, without any debate, that is exactly what they're doing. And then they're going to lecture China about how you shouldn't help Russia. Let us kill Russia and then come for you next. And don't you try to intervene at any time in the process. Now, China's realistic about this. Obviously, they know that what is going on in Ukraine is directly related to their fate. If Russia is somehow eliminated, that is going to isolate China and allow the West to then pivot entirely over to China and focus all of their attention and resources on China. And so they know this. On the other hand, China is very serious about consistency in their foreign policy. If they say no intervention, they mean no intervention. If they say adhere to the international law, that's what they will do. So if they're going to announce anything in regards to assisting Russia, in this conflict specifically, there will have to be some sort of way that fits into international law. And I'm not an international law expert. I don't know what angle they could use to do that. But I think that could kind of be a framework in trying to guess what China is going to say. I mean, we'll know soon enough as it is. But I think China, people say, why doesn't China help Russia? I mean, the China and India and many other countries not going along with the sanctions alone helps Russia in a huge, huge way.
Oh, indeed. And also the fact that, both China and Russia are permanent members of the Security Council. There's not much needed there. Either one of them can veto. And since this directly has to do with Russia, China generally can just abstain from whatever the US and NATO brings, the West brings to that forum. And, I mean, in my opinion, it feels like this ask for China, it's like, where would you like China to help? Because Russia seems to be doing okay on the military front. I mean, what would it take for China to show its solidarity with Russia? It seems like their partnership is all that Russia has asked for, because publicly and privately, we've seen that Russia has respected China's position, and there really hasn't been too many ruffles there. But I'm wondering what your opinion is about that, because I think that is an interesting I think a lot of people, especially who follow us, they want to see an end to this thing and feel like any kind of support that Russia can get can do it. But I just yeah, I'm wondering if you have any other further thoughts on that.
Well, one thing that I guess China could definitely help out with is also in regards to the sanctions. If there are components that Russia needs for different types of weapon systems, those subcomponents could be made available by China, circumventing these sanctions. That would be really important. And there's a lot of ways for Russia to do that without even involving the Chinese government itself. So that's one guess. A lot of the things that we could possibly imagine, if they have artillery munitions, if somehow Russia was running low on that for some reason, maybe something like that. But in terms of ramping up military industrial output, just like it's going to take the U.S. a long time to ramp that up, or we see Russia in the middle of doing it, and they have been for years, and we see the results of that. It would also take China a while to ramp up on their end, if that is something they decide to help Russia with. But let's say they did, that I think that would put an end to it, because this is clearly a war of attrition. And if on the Russian side, Russia's already formidable industrial output combines with China's, then it's a done deal. There's no way the U.S. will ever be able to compete on the same level. A lot of people are talking about these chip production, semiconductors. A lot of the chips that military gear use, they're usually larger. They're not these tiny, super sophisticated chips that we have in our devices and everything. They're specific for a very narrow, focused use, and it's an entirely different type of hardware. So that's something else people should keep in mind. A lot of what we hear coming out of the West is incoherent, because a lot of the people running the West have no idea how anything in reality works. They are people who are involved in law and politics and propaganda, and they are detached from things like industry, manufacturing, and the art of war.
Yeah, and during the Deng Xiaoping era in China, something that Deng Xiaoping used to say and was adopted by much of China's government, Communist Party of China, was hide your strength and bide your time. And I think that is something to consider. I'm wondering your thoughts, Brian, because we say it a lot. It's like time is on the side of Russia. Time is on the side of China. It's not on the side of the collective West. And by China carefully navigating this conflict, and I think Russia as well, I think both, Russia's directly involved. Russia had to launch a special military operation, but both of them have also been very careful in navigating this conflict, ensuring that it doesn't get out of hand for them, balancing all of the various interests that need to be paid attention to. And it just feels like that slogan, that kind of phrase, I really does encapsulate, I think, what the difference is between China, Russia, and the collective West.
Yeah, absolutely. We can see Russia, not just in this current proxy war, but also America's proxy war against Syria and Russia's intervention there. They're extremely patient, and they think far into the future, and they ignore temporary, short-term political setbacks, no matter how humiliating, no matter what the temporary cost is in the short term. Ultimately, all they're focused on is long-term success. We saw that all throughout their intervention in Syria. And I always go back to the example of Turkey shooting down one of their warplanes and ambushing the rescue crew, maybe not Turkey, but militants that they were backing, ambushing the rescue crew. And everyone at the time was livid. They were so angry. They wanted revenge immediately. And Russia didn't do anything, really. I mean, not what you would have expected them to do. And that paid off, because they were thinking the best revenge is ultimately succeeding. that is the best revenge of all. And also, it's the best way to make use of the sacrifices of people involved on the ground. I mean, what did they die for? So you could get petty revenge, or so that you could achieve the objectives that they were there fighting for in the first place. And so you see that all throughout that conflict, and we see that now in the proxy war the U.S. is waging against Russia and Ukraine. We see how patient they are. When they withdrew their troops from Kharkov and Ukrainian forces moved in, when they withdrew from Kherson city to the east bank of the Dnieper River, the Western media had a field day with that. And remember all of the celebrations and how happy everybody was supporting Ukraine. But they're thinking long term, and you can see how that's paying off for them. They preserved their fighting capacity. They still have their fighting capacity. Ukraine expended theirs. Now they're having a crisis in terms of arms and ammunition and trained manpower. And that is the difference between someone thinking long term, playing a game of chess, and someone who's kind of just reacting to things in the moment, like a game of dodgeball. And we see two entirely different approaches and outcomes based on the way they've decided to go about doing this.
Yeah, and on the other side, you have not just in terms of the weapons and throwing everything you have to Ukraine militarily, but you also had the U.S. blew up Nord Stream, and now we have the Hirsch revelations that are just immensely. I mean, the global implications of this has to be included in this conversation, because it shows that lack of patience too, because of course, the U.S.'s strategy here was to weaken Europe. That was a lot of what this is about, to weaken Europe, to ensure that Europe was under its dominion economically, politically. And the blowing up of Nord Stream 2 and the Nord Stream pipelines, that has absolutely had just immense short-term impacts, and that are going to be long-term in nature. What is your reaction to the findings, now that I think all of us suspected that the U.S. was involved? Hirsch seems to have blown the lid off of any doubts that it could have been otherwise. And could you talk about the implications of this globally? Because, I mean, Germany has been the one to suffer the most, but of course, this affects not just Germany. It's a real global problem to think about a superpower like the United States, an imperial superpower, doing what it did to Nord Stream. Hugely impactful.
You're right. It's actually quite frightening that the United States is this weak, insecure, and desperate, and then therefore dangerous, that they would blow up critical infrastructure of an ally, supposed ally. We all know that Germany is a lot like Ukraine. We see the U.S. waging this proxy war through Ukraine, and Ukraine paying this tremendous price, their physical existence, basically. The rest of Europe is really no different. The United States does not care what happens to Europe. They are trying to subordinate them just as much as they subordinated Ukraine, and just as much as they want to subordinate Russia. So the idea, and you can find quotes and you can see videos on YouTube of U.S. officials openly behind podium saying, we can't have Germany and Russia getting together. That is our greatest fear, of them getting together. And why? Why is it their greatest fear? Because they're going to get together and attack the United States? No, because they're going to get together and Europe is going to come out from under the shadow of U.S. hegemony that they've been under since the end of World War II. That's what this is all about. And it's the exact same problem the U.S. perceives regarding China. It's not that China is a threat to the United States. It isn't. It's the fact that the U.S. is going to lose its primacy over Asia. And when you think about it, U.S. hegemony over Europe and Asia, these are two regions of the planet the U.S. does not even reside in. Why should they have primacy over these parts of the world? It's very straightforward, but it's been going on for so long that people kind of take it for granted that it's that way. And some people in their minds may even think, well, it's kind of reasonable that the U.S. didn't want Germany to be getting cheap energy from Russia. They wanted to sell the cheap, much more expensive energy to them, and keep them close to Washington rather than letting too many connections between Russia and Europe. And when you really think about it, and I remember this very clearly as Nord Stream 2 was being built, you could see all of these economic connections being made between Russia and the EU, and you were thinking, this is actually going in the right direction away from conflict, because there's all of these mutual benefits everyone on both sides is receiving. That was a joint pipeline. That wasn't just a Russian pipeline. It was a joint project with Germany. There were other European companies involved. And then Germany was going to receive this cheap energy from Russia and then distribute it across Europe. And everybody was going to make money. It was going to benefit industry in Europe, keep them competitive with the rest of the world. And the US completely eliminated all of this. It's all gone now. And they've physically blew up the pipeline. What are they going to do next? That's, I think, to answer your question, ultimately, what are they going to do next? Because they're this desperate to blow up the pipeline. Where do they go next? What do they do next? They can't stop it. They're too weak to stop it through competition. So what are they going to do next? By force, by terrorism.
Yeah, and you mentioned this comparison between Germany and Ukraine, right? The fact that both of them now are vassals. They're in this position where they're subordinated to U.S. interests. But what's, I think, stunning to a lot of people, I'm sure to anyone in the audience who lives and resides in Europe, is that Germany is really, I mean, it's really second in command in NATO. It's a huge industrial power. It's a country that has had a history, if not a sordid one at times, of having a really a global stature, right? A leadership stature in some ways. Now, I mean, we saw last year, February 7, 2020, this was, 2022, when Biden was standing next to Olaf Scholz and said, we're going to take down Nord Stream 2 if Russia invades. Right in front of Olaf Scholz. I think this is what's stunning to a lot of people, is how Europe has become so much of a vassal, Germany in particular, given that it is a huge competitor. It has a major industrialized economy. It could, in many ways, grow and surpass in a lot, if it were going in the correct direction, continue to grow and be a major player in the world. But now that doesn't feel like the case.
I mean, we often talk about U.S. political interference in places like Ukraine or, say, here in Southeast Asia. But the U.S. is doing the exact same process in Europe itself. They do it through somewhat different processes, sometimes the same processes. And what they do is they maneuver client regimes into power. The German Green Party, all whatever it is that they're supposed to stand for, that is just a smokescreen. They are a client party, an opposition party created and existing for U.S. interests. And I've actually seen the German Green Party involved in U.S. meddling around the world. They're an accomplice. And so that's what you have in Germany. You have people in power who do not pursue Germany's best interests, or Europe's best interests. They are pursuing Washington's best interests at the cost of Germany and at the cost of Europe. And that is what we're seeing. And it's not just in Germany, it's all over Europe. The whole point of the European Union, the bureaucracy, was to kind of consolidate the whole process. Instead of working this country, that country, that country, let's just get one giant bureaucratic layer, lay it over the entire continent. And then all we have to do is bribe and coerce them. And then it'll trickle down imperialism to the rest, and all the nooks and crannies across Europe. And that's exactly what they've done. And it was successful. And we see the result. It is the self-destruction of Europe. Can anyone honestly say anything Europe is doing now at this point is in the benefit of the European people? Even in the benefit of, say, European special interests, I would say no.
Yeah. And I mean, it's so, I think, interesting, given that you have a similar phenomenon in the United States. You have forces like European social democracy. I mean, Europe, the EU was supposed to be it's almost like this integration project, but it's on a completely different set of principles. So on the one hand, you have China and Russia pursuing integration in Eurasia, for example, but it's based on principles of mutuality. the EU was an integration project meant to empower the biggest European countries, along with the United States, to dominate the smaller countries and the weaker countries. And now it feels like that trickle down imperialism, as you called it, has kind of burst. It's kind of blown up, so to speak, in its own face. It's really backfired because now you have the United States doing what it always wanted to do, which is to use the EU to weaken every respective country in Europe so it could hold dominion over the region. And now you have folks, and this is how sad, I think it's pathetic and not even sad. I don't know how much tears we can wipe for these people, but you have people like Joseph Borrell, right? He's supposed to be a socialist, and he is talking about Europe's the garden, the rest of the world is a jungle. Recently, he was lecturing African countries, lecturing China, African countries about, oh, don't, there's going to be consequences if you skirt the sanctions. We're in war mode, and China, if you side with Russia too hard, we're going to make sure there are consequences. This is a supposed socialist, and he's been one of the most vocal supporters of this absolutely destructive proxy war in Ukraine, which has backfired on working people all across the continent.
It's a good point. And what's important to keep in mind is that a lot of these people are Western supremacists, and all of these other isms are camouflage because they can't just openly be Western supremacists. Although, what else can Joseph Borrell come out and say? That's pretty bad already. We're a garden, they're the jungle. I mean, what else could they do but like throw in some slurs in there? Maybe that's the only way to make it more obvious. Maybe get himself a Ukrainian military uniform.
Right.
The problem,
flag, maybe.
Yeah. yeah. So the problem is you have people like this, and I've talked about this, and I talk with people who talk about this all the time. This is greed. It is unchecked greed. The system itself is corrupt. These people are finding themselves into positions of power because of corruption and nepotism. They're not qualified to be in these positions. They have a completely different system than, say, in Russia, and more so in China. And you were just talking about some of the differences. When Russia, China, and their nations along their periphery talk about integration, there is one principle that reigns supreme, and that's national sovereignty. When the West is talking about integration, they're talking about subordination and consolidation under one single system controlled by one circle of people. So it's an entirely different concept. And then also, when you look at the people running Russia, or even their education system, they prioritize practical skills, engineering, industry, manufacturing, things that when you look around at civilization, these are the physical aspects that make civilization civilized. And same goes for China. And then in the West, we've seen a complete departure for this, where the people running things are professional politicians, career politicians. They have never had a real job in their life. They have no useful skills. And there's a detachment between them and reality, and their agenda that they envision unfolding in their head and how it's actually unfolding in reality. And it is kind of just the tropism of greed, just this blind pursuit of power and wealth, and at the expense of everything else, including when you are so myopically focused on just wealth and power, you lose sight of really important things that actually play into your own self-preservation. And that is what's happened to every single empire throughout human history that has risen and fallen, and that is exactly what's happening to the West. And everyone seems to understand that this is what's going on. They understand how increasingly desperate and thus dangerous the West has become. A lot of countries are trying to just time out the clock, just let the time run out. They don't want to confront the West. And I don't think Russia or China want to confront the West, but at the same time, they have to protect themselves. And so we're going to see the West crossing red lines to provoke both Russia and China. We already see them provoking Russia. We see them attempting to provoke China. And so this is where the real battle lines are. It's between this dysfunctional unipolar system that's unraveling, and multipolarism, and the concept of the primacy of national sovereignty versus this unipolar order that's still trying to impose itself on everyone.
Right, right. Yeah, no, those are great points. And I think this is a great place to now transition a bit to there aren't any questions yet, I don't think, in the chat. So for those who are in the chat, you can leave a super chat to ask a question for Brian, and I can read it. And also for those of you who are viewing this, you can subscribe on Patreon, on YouTube, or on Substack as a member and submit your questions before I interview guests, and I will read them toward the end of the stream. So you can find all those links in the description. But there are a few stories that I had kind of saved up because I find them very interesting. And so we've been talking about China, and recently there was a Munich Security Conference we mentioned before. There was an interesting comment made by a former colonel of the People's Liberation Army, his name is Zhao Bo. Now he works at Tsinghua University for one of their think tanks, one of their national security, international security think tanks. And he had something really interesting to say. Arnaud Bertrand, I'm going to pull up his tweet that has a clip from it, because I think I'd like to hear your opinion on this, Brian, because he makes a really interesting point. So before he answers this question, he's talking about how China isn't going to be a quote-unquote world-class military like the United States anytime soon. However, because that's a lot of the questions that this DW journalist was asking, when is China going to catch up to the U.S. military? What will that mean? And he's saying, well, all we need to do is defend ourselves and our sovereignty. So there's that word sovereignty again that you mentioned, Brian. But then he's asked this question, and I want you all to hear his answer. So this is a former top senior colonel of the People's Liberation Army. He served in the Air Force, and he was stationed in, he had specializations, Asia, Africa. He's very prominent voice. That's why he still talks about these things. And here's what he had to say in response to the question of, well, what is the dangerous period coming up between the U.S. and China? When will that be?
And that is the time where you feel that there will be some kind of showdown, do you feel, between the U.S. and China in the coming years in the Western Pacific? Is that becoming more and more inevitable?
No, I don't think so. On the contrary, I believe that will be the time when this relationship become somewhat stabilized.
So he's talking about 2030 and afterward for context. He said 2030 and afterward, things will be stabilized, just so you know what time period he's talking about.
And before it becomes stabilized, this is the most dangerous time. So from now till that time, this is the most dangerous time.
So, Brian, there's been a lot of things that have happened recently that I think would kind of confirm what Zhao Bo said there. There's of course been the huge military encirclement that we've talked about here together. There's been the Taiwan provocations. There's also been recently the balloon incident. The U.S. spent millions of dollars, it seemed like, shooting down what China says was a weather aviation balloon, and that they've spent millions shooting down supposedly similar balloons as well. And of course, there's a whole host of other things that are going on between the U.S. and China. But what do you have to make about what Zhao Bo had to say there in terms of this dangerous period now until 2030? We had Mike Minahan as well with the leaked memo. What are your thoughts on what he had to say there?
Well, I had been saying that because we see U.S. military leaders, politicians, and the media saying, we're going to end up in a war with China over Taiwan, and they make it out as if it's going to be China that provokes the war. But as I've said over and over again, it's the United States that's in a big rush. And the question that was just asked and answered, after 2030, what happens after 2030? I'll tell you what happens after 2030. China is so powerful militarily and economically that the United States attacking China in any sort of meaningful way and thinking that it's going to get anything of any sort of positive outcome will be very unlikely. It will be kind of, everything is going to be inverted at that point, where the United States no longer has the ability to act with impunity on the global stage, and China is more than capable of protecting itself militarily and economically. And I've been covering this for years and years. China knows that they're being encircled. They understand that the West has all of these plans. The West writes about them in publicly available policy papers. You can download them from these U.S. government-funded think tanks. They talk about strangling maritime trade for China. China knows this. This is why they're working on the Belt and Road Initiative. Now they've got this cross-border trade with Russia. How is the U.S. going to disrupt that? But we see the U.S. even trying to disrupt the Belt and Road Initiative. They do it under the guise of competing. They've never actually built any competing infrastructure. What they've done instead is arm and back violent terrorists to kill the engineers working on these projects and physically attack the infrastructure itself. So this is what's actually already going on between the U.S. and China. I see it personally as a proxy war already taking place. The U.S. is killing Chinese civilians, businessmen, engineers. They've made attempts on Chinese diplomats using these terrorist groups that they back. That is a proxy war right there, already ongoing, and not just in one particular area, but all along China's periphery. And this is why we see China investing in its military. It's so serious about building up this infrastructure to circumvent all of these ways the U.S. is trying to constrict and strangle China economically. And they feel by 2030 they will be successful. And not only will the gap narrow between the U.S. and China militarily and economically, but it'll start to broaden again, this time in China's favor. And that's when the U.S. will learn some manners and maybe some humility and act like a normal, constructive nation among nations at that point. But until then, and he's absolutely right, we have no idea what they're quite frankly, they are racist. They are racist and they are psychopaths, and they cannot accept the fact that a non-white nation is surpassing them, which is what is happening. It is almost inevitable. And we don't know how far they will go to try to stop that, reverse that somehow.
Right. Well, the questions are rolling in now. So let's, Mobius Zero says, why do people think that war between the U.S. and China will not happen in any lifetime? Taiwan, the general's prediction and anti-China sentiment. How is war not practically fate or destiny at this point? What do you think?
Every aspect in the U.S. Government, military, media is gearing up for war and trying to provoke war with China. That in every single way, the U.S. is doing absolutely everything it can to start a war with China now, sooner than later, because like I said, it only gets worse for the U.S. each year. Danny, I don't know if I talked about the CSIS Taiwan war game with you, but they put out this war game and they said, we'll win, but winning was all life, industry and infrastructure on Taiwan being scoured off of the island. They would politically remain autonomous, but at the cost of their physical existence. So that's where they see right now. And every year from now into the future, that outcome will just become worse and worse for the U.S. So they know that, and they're trying to provoke a war. China is trying to avoid a war at all costs. And it's a two-pronged process where they're trying to build up their military to deter the United States. If their military is powerful enough, there's no way Washington is going to convince the Pentagon to do this, because it'll be suicide. And then also on the other hand, they're just trying to work together with anyone else who will work with them and move on without the U.S. until the U.S. is ready to work constructively with them as equals, which is such a simple thing to do, but for the U.S. apparently not.
Well, the sociopathy here in narcissism is just incredible, because CSIS has done this. I believe CNEC, the Center for New American Security, they've had war simulations, and they all conclude that there's going to be, these are all weapons contractor funded, US government funded think tanks, but they all conclude that, yeah, the destruction is going to be intense. What's so narcissistic about it is this inability to see that actually it's going to not only be destructive for China, it's going to be destructive for the United States and for the entire West. Any kind of shockwave, we've already seen it with Russia, Ukraine, any kind of shockwaves that are sent toward these major emerging powers and now outright global powers at this point is going to backfire heavily. And it has already when it comes to Russia. With China, I think the consequences are just that much more profound.
Yes, absolutely.
So let's see. Another question here. Here we go from Tish. They're asking, Brian, is there anything the U.S. regime can do to prove that they can be trusted by Russia, especially with the call for his head and regime change? So is there anything the U.S. can do to win over trust from Russia?
No, and the United States, the current interests in power right now would never seek to get Russia to trust them unless it was to just betray them again. And I don't think people say that Putin was tricked. I don't think that he was actually tricked. I don't think Russia was tricked. I think they knew all along the U.S. was acting in bad faith, but they had to go through the motions to prove that at least they were acting in good faith. They went through the motions, they went through the procedures, they made the sacrifices, and they lost on their end trying to do the right thing and to meet somewhere in the middle, like reasonable people. And it was the US, make it clear to the world that it was the US who provoked all of this and is in the wrong. I don't think for a moment, I mean, if I knew that they had no intention of honoring any of this and they were just playing for time, surely Russia knew. They knew, but they had to go through the motions. Now, what will actually happen, so when we think long term, what will happen for any nation to trust the United States again will be a completely different circle of special interests coming to power and running and directing U.S. foreign and domestic policy, and that'll be very obvious to all. And you will see them pursuing interests that are mutually beneficial to themselves and everyone else, which is pretty much how every other country in the world, except for some reason in the West, conducts their foreign policy. I know it sounds hard to believe, but it actually is true.
So Mobius Zero has another question. Are any U.S. politicians anti-China? Are there any that exist? I mean, if people think war with China will never happen, I mean, what do you think, Brian? Have you observed any?
I can't think of any. And the thing that constantly shocks me on a daily basis are people who pop up in my comment section, and then you have politicians who are exactly like this too, where they're like, Brian, you're absolutely right about Ukraine. Your analysis on Ukraine, no one does a better job than you, but you're 100% wrong about Taiwan. And then they start listing literally talking points right out of the U.S. State Department. And I just wonder where that comes from. And I really do think that it comes from this Western supremacy and also racism. And I know it is a huge factor. I'm an American. I grew up in America, and I was surrounded by people who they've just looked at Chinese people and Asian people in general as caricatures, cartoon characters, living stereotypes. They did not respect them. They looked down on them. Instead of looking at the differences and learning something from them, they looked down on them for them. And this goes from the ground level in America all the way up to the leadership, and the leadership is encouraging it. You know how sensitive the U.S. is about certain issues regarding race and religion, but it seems like it's open season for Asians, and it has been for years and years. It just gets worse every time I check. It gets worse.
Yeah, and I mean, war propaganda to wage wars. We were talking about this earlier with regard to the earthquake before we came on live. You have tens of thousands of people in Turkey, in Syria, dead from an earthquake, and you have the U.S. maintaining sanctions on Syria. And in order to do such profoundly cruel acts and policies, and to torture people, to hurt people, to kill people en masse for your geopolitical interests, for your narrow interests, The only way you have to, I mean, you have to dehumanize. And you've talked about this, I know, with Carl and Mark Sloboda on your programs about Chinese history. I mean, how could the U.S. enforce an open door? How could the U.S. try to subordinate China for the last, several hundred years without some kind of ideology? Europe was a huge participant in it too, the Yellow Peril. So all of this is real. I mean, you can't divorce it from the geopolitics, because no matter where you look in the world, where the US is waging war, where NATO is waging war, there is an ideology of dehumanization that backs it up. It's 100% necessary in their eyes.
Think about this. The stereotype that Asian people have no creativity, and all of the technology that China has, they just copied the West. And these are tropes that you see all throughout racist anti-Asian circles all across the West. And then it manifests itself in Western foreign policy. And they accuse China of stealing intellectual property, and everything that they have, they stole from us, because only white people can come up with these ideas. Certainly not the people who invented paper and gunpowder and everything like that when we were still living in the dirt. But never mind that. And this is how you can see the racist tropes that everyday people have floating around in their minds, and it goes all the way up to actual policy being constructed and used on the global stage.
Yeah. No, it's 100%.
Well, we were also talking right before the show about I forget what the guy's name is. He's maybe he's some policy wonk.
Yeah, let me bring up. I got the tweet up. I don't know what he is. He worked on Mitt Romney's campaign. He's some kind of Republican Party something or other. We can call him just a China watcher here, but he's not really a China watcher. He just adopts
China
hater. Politics.
Yeah,
China hater. Exactly. So actually, let me before I pull it up, let me just make sure it's paused, because it's one of these Douyin videos. All right, so here we go. We're gonna pull up the video of his name is Aaron Jin is his name.
Yeah.
So he says, don't visit China anytime soon. Going anywhere requires signing up for their social credit system. And here is the video in question. All right. And then I will just read a reply or two to thoroughly debunk this nonsense, and then get your comments, Brian. Here we go.
Use this QR code with WeChat. Oh, really? Yeah. That's great. Use the QR code to log in. Do you type your password? It says.
So that's all we need to watch for that. It's almost a minute long. But of course, the implication here is that this child is basically enforcing the social credit system in China. And then there's some really interesting replies. Here is one. So this went viral on Douyin, which is the Chinese TikTok. And it says it went viral with over 500,000 likes because a kid in China is helping a pretty looking foreigner use WeChat at a supermarket. Nothing to do with social credit score. So that's the image of that. And of course, Arnaud Bontrand, he also had a little thread about it. But you did a video, Brian, on social credit. And also you've done a lot on this propaganda war on China. What are your thoughts about this? Because I feel like this goes right into what we were just talking about with dehumanizing China. I mean, this is a child. It's so obvious. You just watch the video. This child's just helping these people figure something out.
You can hear him say about WeChat Pay. And so what a lot of Westerners,
he's like trying to help them. Yeah.
What a lot of Westerners who have never traveled abroad don't understand is that there is another, there are countries outside of the West, they have their own banks and they have their own social media platforms and their own financial services and payment services other than what the West offers. And when you go to, say, a supermarket, even here in Thailand, Thailand has huge banks, and they all have their different payment systems. And you have, if you want to do something like a cashless payment, you have to be in their system. They don't care what you're using in America. It's Thailand. They don't care. Just like America wouldn't care that you're from Thailand. You have some ties, to an American obscure system from Thailand. They don't care. You got to use the system that's being used there in that country. And that's all that was going on in that video. Had nothing to do with social credit. And I've looked into social credit because I wanted to know, why are people asking me about social credit? So I looked into it and I put a whole video together about it. And it was all based on Western media articles, not a single article from China or even a source that could be conceived as pro-Chinese. These were all extremely anti-Chinese articles when you read through them. But when you read the entire article and think about what they're actually saying, they're saying, no, it doesn't exist the way people think it does. A lot of it is common sense things, like if you're on a train and you're smoking in a train, they're going to put your name in the system. You're not going to be able to go on the train again. It's like, why would you want someone who's blatantly breaking safety and health rules to be on the train? And you see this all over the world and manifests itself in all different ways. China's just using technology because they've got 1.4 billion people. You can go to like a convenience store in America and they'll have pictures of people's faces that can't be served there because they've written bad checks or something. Like that used to be a thing, and they would put your face right there near the cash register. So that's all that is. But these people, they know it's not true, but they also know that Americans don't know what's going on out of the country, and they'll believe these lies because they already have their prejudice already. And it won't take much. They want to believe the lie. They want to believe that China's evil and backwards and gross and weird. They want to believe that. So they'll buy into these stories no matter how flimsy they actually are and how little evidence exists to substantiate them.
And I think forces like this, people like Aaron Jin, they have to make it really scary, because one of the things I think even just in this video that is revealed is that you have people from the West very confused, do not know how to even use this kind of technology. When I was there, I couldn't. First of all, I didn't, I think it's probably the case that those who are being helped, those foreigners from the West, they might have a deeper relationship in China and just don't understand. I mean, WeChat Pay is quite complex. It's different. It's digital payments. And it is an advancement in technology, especially financial technology, which the alarm bells are already being sounded. You have people at Credit Suisse. You have huge Western financiers talking about how concerning it is that there are these digitalized currencies coming about, these digitalized central bank currencies. You have de-dollarization, all of this. I think part of this is just a deliberate propaganda campaign to deflect from what actually is happening, which is China is surpassing the West, and actually emerging economies will follow right along at some point in the future if they are successful in charting this multipolar world.
Yeah, and there's a lot of things that China, who supposedly they can't come up with any ideas on their own, but they're actually leading the world in multiple fields, including financial technology. And you're exactly right, because if that was a video of some kid helping a woman with her Visa or MasterCard, this wouldn't be an issue because, hey, they're using our stuff, so that's great. Not move along, nothing to see here. But they have their own unique system. This is what allows someone like Aaron to prey on ignorant people, because people don't know about these other systems. And then they just look at it. They don't know what it is. So he's saying it's social credit. So in their mind, they believe it's social credit. It surely couldn't be Chinese people coming up with their own system that is as good or better than what the West uses on a day-to-day basis.
So we just have one more question, and then we can close out. Irish Partisan asks, do you see global conflict, World War III, breaking out this decade? Will it be Russia, China versus the West? Your thoughts, Brian? It's an ominous question, but a good one. It's trending all the time on Twitter.
Yeah, we're in it right now. This is already World War III. It's just a question of how far is it going to go. Like I said, the U.S. is killing Chinese people right now all around the world using terrorists that they arm and back to do it. They have opposition. Like I mentioned several examples in Pakistan. The U.S. for many years now has been backing Baluchistan separatism, and this is to disrupt the China-Pakistan economic corridor. And they have terrorists who just literally kill Chinese engineers, blow up infrastructure, and they also made an attempt on the Chinese ambassador's life at a hotel. And this was all, I mean, this has spanned many years, and it's going on even this year, right now, 2023. And in Myanmar, the military there ousted the U.S. client regime that they installed into power, just like they installed the client regime into power in Georgia 2003, Ukraine 2014. The military ousted it, and then the U.S. is backing this opposition. They're carrying out terrorism. Just if the U.S. can't have it, nobody will. So they're just trying to destroy Myanmar. But again, also, while they're doing all of this, they are deliberately attacking Chinese factories. There's a Chinese pipeline that is part of the Belt and Road Initiative that runs through Myanmar that they have attacked. And even here in Thailand, there's for now, there's no major violent movement in Thailand, but the U.S.-backed opposition here has openly come out and said they want to cancel the Thai-Chinese high-speed rail. And they are completely backed up one side and down the other by the U.S., the National Endowment for Democracy. So this is what the U.S. is doing in absolutely every single country. And you have people being killed. That is already a proxy war. Ukraine is a proxy war. Syria is a proxy war. The deadly violence unfolding all over Iran, that is a proxy war. When you really add it all up, it is World War III. Just because of the threat of direct conflict and the possibility of a nuclear exchange, they're doing it by proxy. So it's kind of a slow motion version of a world war. And it's just a matter of how far it escalates.
Yeah, and also it feels like also a matter of the conditions just being different in 2023 than World War I or World War II. You know, you had immense competition then between these European imperial powers, colonial powers, the United States lumping in there. There was intense competition among them. But ever since World War II, the end of it, of course, U.S. has reigned supreme as the superpower. And that has run its course. And so now the dynamic is, as the Irish partisan asked, Russia, China versus the West. But it's even bigger than that because it really is a global South. It is this kind of formerly colonized, or, in some cases still colonized world, moving out of the vice grip of U.S. hegemony. And that means, the conditions are different. And it's also happening at a time where, as that's happening, the world is much closer together. It is more dependent. The U.S. dollar system did that. Globalization did that. But really, the rise of these emerging economies in the global South has also done that, because the more that they rise, the more that China rises, Russia builds up its strength again, and the rest of the countries in Africa and Latin America begin to also climb out of underdevelopment, the more that the world becomes dependent on them and dependent on what happens to them. And that means that the shock waves and the way that war is fought is much different, but at the same time, no less, I think, important. And this World War III label maybe needs to be broadened out and become a little, I guess, more sophisticated in its definition for our purposes.
Absolutely. I just noticed in the comment section, people asking, what is your evidence that the U.S. is backing Baluchi separatism? I've done many videos. I lay it all out, and I have links directly to the National Endowment for Democracy's webpage, where they list the Baluchistan groups that they're backing, how they're involved in their politics. And this goes for any other group that I talk about being backed by the U.S. I will not say it unless I have substantial evidence. Regarding Baluchistan specifically, all the way back in 2011, in Congress, they were trying to pass, bills and resolutions about supporting Baluchistan independence. So it is a irrefutable fact that they are backing them. Yes.
Yeah, and I mean, Pakistan's whole history is really this attempt to continue to carve up. I mean, it's almost a byproduct of that, and it really is that region has had to deal with so much. I know you cover it with regard to how the West has attempted to, slice it up for its own purposes, and that legacy continues. And you're exactly right, Brian. But I think it's a good place here to close up. So before everyone goes, though, be sure to hit that like button before you go. Subscribe to this channel. Hit that notifications bell. And of course, if you would like to submit questions, suggest guests, and overall get premium content from me, be sure to subscribe on Patreon. That link is in the description. Be sure also to consider YouTube membership or Substack membership. Very similar benefits across the board. Be sure to subscribe for free on Substack and on Telegram. You can follow me. All of those links are in my link tree and the link in the description. That helps fight off the censorship, creates an email list. And of course, Telegram, as I know Brian is well aware, is a bit more safer option for social media purposes. So Brian, I'm going to give it to you now for any plugs, anything you're working on, where you'd like to direct people.
Well, first of all, thank you again, Danny, for having me on. Thanks to your audience for tuning in and listening live or the recorded version afterwards. And if you want to find and follow my work, just type in the New Atlas in YouTube. And then in the video description of any video of mine, just scroll down. You will see all the other places you can find and follow my work.
Great. Well, it's been a little bit since I last streamed. I took a bit of a week off. I will probably be back Thursday and or Friday as we approach this 1-year anniversary. So be sure to catch me then. But until then, everyone, have a great rest of your day and week. And I will be back with you all soon. Bye-bye now.